pretty excited about this discussion for week 6. It's not the one yesterday, but the one from last Sunday, talking about the different levels and teaching in banks. And there's quite a bit here that's very rich. I'm going to go through a brief summary. I kind of came up with this. I was over at the coffee shop. I just had a nice nap after I drank coffee. But I came up with several things summarizing both classes. I took extensive notes over many people and their commentary. I'll mention some names, but it's mainly just the ideas were so rich. I wrote a group of 10 ideas. Now, I do note that the first level, the contributions or the additions, and as you go up to the transformational, that most people in lower grades do look at, starting with the simplest one, contributions or maybe additions, so forth. Number one, look for multicultural situations and groups to teach about in your community or in the history of your community. That's really number two. So if you have a history of Native Americans in your community, it's a natural fit. Now, I'm giving you part of this, Three Stooges. Anyhow, I'm giving you part of this because I want to give you ideas of what's safe enough to try, because there is some anxiety about, depending on your situation. Obviously, if you teach in a very small community and very strong views about certain things, or if you're in a religious school, or if you're in a school that has certain rules that go on, then you have to be careful because your job could be on the line. At least you want to try to promote things without too much controversy. Still, as I saw with several of you, there were those that felt there are some issues, whether it's within things you know in your family or you have a disabled children in class, that you got to stand up and sometimes you have to push. I had a friend who used to say push the envelope. That's not very strong saying. I would say you have to push hard to get recognition for certain groups because it's the right thing to do, that people understand that they can't just pretend the people in their school are invisible. Because of whatever situation, whatever unfortunate label's been placed on them, and that, as it said in the movie, you may be different, but you're not less. Temple Grandin. That movie's always useful for this class. So I got number one in multicultural situations close to you. So if you have a Czech German community, that's a natural thing to touch on. Nobody's going to object to that. Got a flea in there or something's killing me. Look to history of the community. That's usually a natural connection. Who could object to that? I mean, Native Americans nearby, African Americans, etc. Another one is begin with contributions, but involve other levels gradually. One that I want to kind of jump to, somebody mentioned with disabled students, that you could jump to 4, transformational, because you don't just want to talk about disabled students flatly. You want to add, you want to be able to get respect in the community for them. And so you may want to do projects, activities, and you can be very aggressive. I mean, how many people are going to come to school and complain that disabled students shouldn't be acknowledged? Now, there could be such people, but I think you have a natural alliance there that bypasses some of the old attitudes. Okay, another one is be aware of the cognitive level of your students and what level they are and how much they can handle. And I just want to throw in one here that I'm going to come in later, but don't preach, because preaching never works. Preaching without the more subtle demonstration and experiences is not going to be as effective in promoting multicultural understanding. It'll look like you just have an ideology trying to force it through. Give some thought to current trends in society, especially in your community or your state. Example would be transgender issues. You may not have that at your school, there may be a small school, but you could have individuals there. Whatever issue it is that strikes with multicultural, if it's pertinent because you have individuals in the school, then it has to be addressed in some way. You have to be more subtle about it sometimes. Depends if you're going to get some kickback or retaliation. But I think that you have to look at current trends in society. That's what motivates us. We see stuff, we say, oh, people are talking about this issue. Sixth, do not begin with a broad statement of a position which can be used against you. And I'm saying being subtle. Don't declare war on some attitude in the community. Declare understanding, declare experience, collaboration, coordination, whatever. One of the examples I put is having books in the library. Kids may not be required to read them, but they're in the library so that people can kind of hint, you may want to read this book or read that book. So it's talking about different issues. You may have one about civil rights, and maybe kids don't normally take a look at it, but you say, well, I think you'll want to read this. That's why when I showed you those books I have in my case about following the Black Cowboys, the Negro League baseball. You may have kids that love baseball but aren't very into race relations, don't know anything about it. You say, well, there was a time when there were leagues when only the ball was white. Okay, that's the old expression, that only the ball was white, because the African Americans until 1947 could not play in the major leagues. And there was a whole culture and history. There's a Negro League Museum in Kansas City. If you ever get a chance, go to it. Right next to it is the Jazz Museum. So you can get a huge amount of culture in just two things. Here's another one. So I wanted you to avoid that. I want you to create experiences, and one of the ideas is that came up in here, and brilliant statements here from both classes. Have the students research and carry the conversation. That's different than you going in and trying to, someone accusing you of imposing something. If it comes up, let it follow. Doesn't mean if you give them a little spark or they see a book or a movie and you talk about it. Some of you mentioned in STEM, Hidden Figures is a great one. I haven't seen that movie, but I should get it and put it on here for people to watch. I will after. I won't get in trouble for doing that, but I have to buy a copy. Involve local community leaders. April, I remember when I was first reading this, April brought this up in 01 class, 80401, is that you get people that represent the community and diversity, and they talk about careers. So you have credibility with that. Another one is sources, and I grabbed a couple of them here. I didn't get the teaching tolerance, but if you just Google teachingtolerance.org, I think it is, you will get an opportunity to get free magazines that teach about different cultures. Now, here's another one, and I got this. There's quite a bit of money, and if you want to look up free sources for the Holocaust, this is a good place to start. If you have a community that denies the Holocaust, then you got a real problem in your community, a very serious problem. This one is called the Teen Witnesses to the Holocaust. So this gives you an idea. And this is just from Saddleback Publishing. But this books like this, they give the teenager version or perspective on what was going on in Nazi Germany. Okay. So our next one, intelligence report. If you subscribe to this, disability hate crimes as well as alt-right speakers. This is much more confrontational. It talks about hate groups in the United States, Charlottesville, and it's a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a major group that keeps track of hate groups in America. So this is much more graphic. This wouldn't be for kindergarten, obviously, but this could be for high school researchers. So those are some. There's others. If you want free materials, I'll look for some more. Just some things that were mentioned in here in both classes. I took a lot of notes, so forgive me if I go a little long. April mentioned that she's from Guam and making a Chamorro hut. She had students make a hut, I guess like they have in Guam, and students had to make it without any instructions, and they had to figure out how to build a hut. And this experience taught them how hard it is to build shelter when you don't have much money or much material. Some people do experiences where they go out and they spend the night out in the street. Now, you don't do that with elementary kids, but in college or sometimes in high school, you can visit a place where the homeless are. Obviously, you have liability. You got to be careful. You have people see what it's like to live in a refrigerator box. As a little kid, or when you have little kids and you get them a present, sometimes when they're really little, they get more excited about the box than they do the present. They'll play with it more. The theme Brandy brought up that in a religious school, you have a natural obligation to teach acceptance of others. A good example would be against bullying, being bullied. There's all kinds of ways you can be bullied. You could be bullied because you're gay. You could be bullied because of your religious beliefs, or you could be bullied because they're different somebody else's religious beliefs. You could be bullied because you're a girl. There's so many reasons, and it would seem incumbent in a religious school that there's certain natural tendencies there, teachings that would teach acceptance of others. And really, you're just starting with young kids. That's the first thing you want to teach in the first level. You want to teach them information about other cultures, but you do, as that one person mentioned about disabilities in the fourth level, and I will get their names when I get through here, is that makes a big difference. You can actually get people involved. You're not pushing anything, getting involved with activities with those who are disabled. Fundraisers, they're always having fundraisers for different disabilities or for illnesses or juvenile diabetes, things like this. Alzheimer's for people like me, you get old. I mentioned one thing I wanted to mention, the darkness and the grim fairy tales. Those German fairy tales are really grim, literally grim. I wonder if that word came from that, but Hansel and Gretel being cooked in an oven, horrible things. I always get nervous reading about the German Black Forest. You never know what's in the forest. People could be all around you. You wouldn't even see them. Several of you commented on the Disney movies, Coco, Moana, and Frozen, and not having watered down versions of them, haha, for Frozen, but having, talking about the cultures behind them. And you can, I think April mentioned that, Moana, you could bring that up with the culture. Taylor mentioned stories about having two moms or having books on kids with disabilities. I know a lot of people are hesitant about anything with LBGQT issues with very young kids, but sometimes that comes up. You have to use your own judgment there with the situation. Teaching music and dance. Emily Klein mentioned La Raspa, and I think it's a Mexican hat dance. It was mixed with another dance in there. Betsy, you did talk about research in different states. You could do it very subtle. Oh, let's talk about the culture of Louisiana or Oklahoma. Okay, as Michelle brought up the dancing and the music, and then she had the math travel tests. Jillian talked about it's very important to teach empathy. I think I mentioned that. I think that private schools, especially if they have kids from abroad, like Haiti and Korea, Gretchen, you mentioned this, that you have a huge opportunity because you have students from those cultures. They may have the same religious belief you do, if it's like a Christian school, but they have the culture. They can teach so much about the culture, and that's really the key there. Having parents come in, talk about, Jessica mentioned this, about the menorah. And Betsy mentioned examining, anti-immigrant statements from kids and talking about the hijab because women wear that. And the men wear clothing too. I just don't know as much about that. Kayla, you mentioned international holidays. Several of you mentioned something about social studies in the first class, and that's what I'm talking about right now. This is for both classes. One of the things is that social studies is being shrunken down while reading and math gets more and more space, which is really sad because multicultural fits better in social studies. Now, there is multicultural in math, but the one thing is you can't inject multicultural as a separate component. It's got to fit in neatly and cleanly with what you're doing. You can't add another 20 minutes to the class time. And so I think if you're teaching math and science, you have to just add bits and pieces of it there, particularly promoting women in STEM classes, math and science, engineering, and technology. Banned Books Week. Wow, Stephanie, that was a good one. I like that. Amanda Joy, you mentioned the Kurdish people, Kurdish and issues of translation and stuff. And the whole Kurdish culture would be a very rich one to examine. I'm trying to think of other ways you could do this. It might be to have a bulletin board or to have some kind of a video maybe the kids could make or with their parents talking about their particular culture, something that kids could use as a resource in the room. I'm just coming up with this. That they could actually make a little demonstration program talking about their culture. And you could have this as a permanent resource in the library. I wouldn't put it on YouTube. I would just use it in the library. Joanna mentioned using history to explore multiculturalism. Molly, you talked about grandparents sharing memoirs, memories. That's very good. Elise, you mentioned to be, you had a more direct, I would say a little more aggressive, I guess, in a way. But it struck me as pretty effective talking about using social action to, especially, I know I would tend to say, yeah, in urban areas, you can be more assertive because there's going to be more tolerance for diversity. But that's maybe not true at all. But it just depends if you can be. We don't want to be shrinking violets. That's an old term. It kind of stereotypes violets. They're actually a perfectly fine flower. But the thing is, we want to be willing to push. Depends on your situation, how you feel about it. If you think there's issues in your community of disability, you need to promote understanding of the disability. I remember there's one, and it probably is in the other class, but it really struck me. I forget who it was, but mentioned a disabled child, probably, I don't know, trying to run down the hall and fell down, was crying. And then some of the other kids, regular classroom kids, made fun of that child. And it really upset me before I even read about them laughing at her, that you could think of think of that's your child is frightened and confused and is running away from the teacher and falls down and is just balled up crying. And people are laughing at them. That just, That really disturbed me when I read that. Okay, trying to end this because I know I want to stop here forever. But there's a lot of good stuff here. Let me see what else. I've been putting it over there. I think it's very important to look at different types of authors to battle stereotypes. I know Ashley Workmeister, you had a really good position on this, and multicultural literature. And you said journal or memoirs of a part-time Indian. Leah mentioned this in the war dance. And some schools won't allow it. And I realize you're being careful. I wonder if the kids can read the books and get them on their own. You can say, well, I can't do it directly, but if you want to buy that book or if you want to borrow it from somewhere, then you can read it. So see what you can do there. Abra, and you mentioned about Stolly and Star, of two wealthy and not so wealthy schools sharing a classroom, and that was really interesting. I think that was in Grand Island, but it was a great multicultural lesson about socioeconomic differences. And Kate Neiman, you mentioned it, and I wrote this down. We have to talk about differences in order for kids, especially LGBTQ, to feel safe. We can't pretend that there are no gay kids in our school. And again, I know you guys some are hesitant. I mean, it depends on where you're at, but anything that let's hope that anything deals with the actual fears of the kid can be addressed so that they do not have to feel that, well, we're not going to talk about that issue. You'll just have to go ahead and be afraid. Different viewpoints. I think I had an Ashley here. I hope it's the same Ashley. I never know. I took a lot of notes, so forgive me. I know I have here, Aaron, you talked about soccer being a huge connection for kids, and that in refugee communities, we have to go to level 4. We can't just stay at level 1 and just show contributions and little additions, but actually deal more directly, especially with a heavily I think the extreme diversity with a lot of tension, you cannot ignore that diversity. You have to embrace it. Obviously, strategically, you have to do it in a proper way. Leah, you talked about mice and men, Mockingbird being useful. Somebody mentioned a Mockingbird being banned in some schools. I'm going to have to look that up. I never even thought that would happen nowadays. And David, you mentioned one. People are still sensitive about they were consolidated, and people were still angry about a feud over what was the going to be the county seat in the late 1800s, and people were still angry about that issue, and the communities didn't get along. I have to believe that was more ethnic. And that's one heck of a long political grudge to hold. I think people in Nebraska, maybe in the rural areas, tend to hold grudges for very long periods of time because I've seen it, especially, I know for many, many years, Lutherans, Catholics didn't marry Swedes and Germans. And, I don't have a lot of direct knowledge of that, but I know I've been told by people that that's true. Now, in the other class, Elizabeth, you mentioned about music, I think that music and art gives us a lot of freedom to address issues that may not be directly addressed as easily in the classroom. What am I saying with that? Well, art gives us ability to address something without directly addressing. I guess that's what I want to say. Music. You can talk about, if you're going to talk about jazz, you need to, I have great books on African Americans and jazz music. And, at one time there was a group of white jazz musicians that went around in the 1920s claiming they invented jazz, believe it or not. I guess they thought, well, nobody would know. We'll just claim it and get all the credit for it commercially. Didn't work out, but for a long time, people thought, oh, these guys invented it, because they wouldn't give credit to African Americans. Scott Joplin didn't matter. Of course, that wasn't jazz, was ragtime, but that's still a type of music that was not something invented by any Europeans. Colleen, you focus on acceptance of the younger kids. And Maggie made a really good discussion. You said you can't teach language without addressing culture. You can't separate language and culture. That's why language is such a sensitive issue, how you speak, whether somebody's Southern and has a drawl, or their grammar is not quite the same, or it's Ebonics, or it's some kind of slang, or it's Spanglish. People get very upset about language, especially if it's somehow permitted or allowed in the schools. Colleen, you made I think, a very important one about teaching women and girls to be strong leaders. Mentioned the Girl Scouts, and you had a really interesting one about in a family, and I assume these are international or refugees, where the mother could not get a child off the bus if a male was driving. And these are things you may find out with other cultures, that you just assume the mother or the father, either one, can do something, but you may find out that I found out a long time ago initially with the refugees. I was doing home visits with a lady, but she told me I could never go to the home. I forget, it was Central American family, and they did not speak English. I spoke some Spanish, but it would be very inappropriate for me to go do a home visit if the father was at work and the mother was there. That would not be good to do that. So I was very cautious after that, because that was almost always the situation, because both parents weren't home in the daytime. They were working at the slaughter plant. Colleen, and it was in here where Haley was speaking. Maybe it was Haley. Yeah, I think, oh yeah, Haley. You were talking about using both levels 1 and 4 in some situations. So I think you got to think twice or several times. What these levels aren't necessarily in a certain step. Like, well, we'll just talk about contributions. We'll do addition. Now I'm going blank on the third one, but you know what it is. And transformational, the last one. That you may have situations where it would be possible to do transformational curriculum. You think normally, well, you wouldn't do that just starting off, and of course not. But you may have situations, and I mentioned disabilities as one. You can probably push things pretty hard with disabilities. Caitlin, you mentioned in one of yours about the glass ceiling and how it's important in math that women be allowed to promote that women can be successful in mathematics. And what we get is a situation where people have always been in the leaders. Like, people may look and say, well, look at the guys in Congress or something, almost all white men making these decisions. Well, it's better than it used to be, but it still hasn't changed dramatically. And generationally, it's very slow, because there's certain traditions of the older people getting the power. And they happen to be getting in the 80s. I'm just in my 60s, but the point is, when you look up there and you see a group of people and none of them look like you or have much in common with you, and they're the authorities, then you begin to question things. Okay? Doesn't mean they weren't duly elected democratically, but it still means that there's a incongruency or whatever between what you see there and what you see here. That's why it's great to have diversity in the teaching population. They used to go the other way. You wanted more male teachers, especially in elementary school, because people would think, oh, elementary teachers are going to be women, and high school is going to be a mix with a lot of men in there. But why can't guys teach elementary school? And of course they do. But that was a change. It's the same with nursing. Kind of went the opposite way. medical doctors. Used to be, there weren't very few women surgeons, okay? And people still have very primitive beliefs about some of that stuff, especially when they're having a heart operation and they'll actually, oh, this guy, he got his degree in South Africa, or this guy, he's got his degree in Poland, you know, can he operate on me or can she operate on me? And people have all these stereotypes, especially when they get afraid. So that's the one thing, people, when they get afraid or when they're under great stress, they actually retreat to their original language. Say, for instance, I break my leg and I'm in intense pain. You won't see me yelling out in Spanish, even though I can speak some Spanish. You're going to see me yelling out in English, and even yelling out. I remember things that would really disturb me. You ever watch Full Metal Jacket? One of the hardest scenes is the leader of the group gets shot by a sniper, and he's dying. He shoots him right through the aorta. And his buddy's there with him trying to talk to him, and the guy's calling out for his mom like a little boy. Mom, mommy. And then you realize that in the last moment of his life, he's like a child. He retreats all the way back to the language of being a little boy, crying out to his mother. And it really just floors you in that scene. Oh, I wanted to know from Susan where Mockingbird is getting banned, because that would really be interesting. I never thought of To Kill a Mockingbird as controversial now. Jill, you had a statement about teaching in our comfort zone. And you came up with the idea, you'd been talking to Nolan about ways to brainstorm to get your students to think about how would they make other students more welcome at your school. It's a good little exercise for them. How would they make other students more welcome in their school? Culture fair, Justin Bray, you brought up the culture fair. Have a culture fair, and it could be in many different ways. You talk about you're doing robotics, 5th and 6th grade. So you can do it with a career. You can do it with other groups. You can do it with languages. I mean, multicultural is kind of everything and almost nothing. It's almost everything. Let's put it that way. It's not nothing, but Tessa, you mentioned I had a nice piece on the rights of the disabled. And we know we got the American Disabilities Act, but in fact, you know, you could ask, is it really being enforced? And do people with disabilities find themselves in situations where they can't do anything, or they can't get transported, etc.? I remember people being very resistant at this little school I was at, even to providing allowing them to tape record their lecture. They were upset about that. I don't want them tape recording it. And I said, well, can you give them the notes? No, I don't do notes. I just talk off the top of my head like I'm doing now. And so the idea they couldn't have any copy of what was going on, and they had a hearing disability or something like that. Maybe it was processing. But I mean, this person was very liberal politically, but very resistant, just like, how dare they tell me how to run my classroom? When you have people in your community or in your family that have a disability, or as somebody mentioned, if you have someone in your family who's gay, or someone in your family who's adopted and they're of a different racial group or a different language group or something, you're going to be on the lookout. You're going to think about how's my kid going to be treated, and how do I want my students to treat people, in particular, like my kid. That's when this gets really sharp. And Ashley brought that up, and I thought, wow, that you don't just gloss over it when it's something affecting your family. And Jennifer, you had one. My goal is to make my student make what we're talking about in culture my students' discussion. Now that's why I like this assignment. I got so much stuff in here from you all, and I really couldn't. I started replying to them by email, but I decided to do this video because I decided there's too much, and I wanted to share what I see in other people's stuff with all of you in this video. Cowboy culture. This was brought up by, let's see who brought this up. Was it Aaron? I think it was Aaron. He brought up cowboy culture where you live. And I thought that was interesting because every culture counts, not just a majority culture, or what appears to be, I don't know, culture maybe the one in power or something. But to most people in the United States, cowboy culture is not a majority culture. It's something very unique and one I would like to know more about. And it goes way back in the history of the United States, how it evolved. Again, that's just looking. And then I get to Justin when you talked about that disabled student I mentioned a while ago that was crying and how you had to have a teachable moment with other students to understand that. And Sarah, I think you mentioned about different families, and this could be culture, a different culture, different religion, LBGQ, I always have LBGQT, LGBTQ, QT. There you go. Get a little tired. You mentioned that you had a former teacher at your school who was African American and gay, and he had a very low profile about his relationship, his partner. Very good entry. And where some people tread lightly, others are going to say what they got to. You got to do what you got to do. Be aggressive. This one about Latin with an X on it from Maggie was very interesting because there are many people who are gay who are from other cultures. And so how is that addressed? I've never heard the Latinx before, so I really learned something from this. But also you talk about they had the Guatemalan Civil War, huge issue. This is something where you can get into politics of American foreign policy in Central America ever since, especially after World War II when they were fighting communism. And I can tell you, I studied this extensively in my college years. The leaders of Nicaragua, Guatemala were overthrown by American involvement, and we put in dictators. Somoza in Nicaragua, a number of dictators, the guy in Haiti, Papa Doc, and did incredible damage to their government because it didn't form a government. It was the government of a personal dictator, and it was a matter of time before he'd either died or was overthrown or somebody challenged him as another dictator, and it leads to corruption and chaos in those countries. And you see that now. We could get into a huge discussion about the drug issues in Mexico, Colombia. Venezuela's a mess, and that's not one I would have blame at all on the United States. But the fact that these countries did not form strong, stable governments means that at some point, when they break down, then we get refugees, and then we get this situation. Putting children in tent cities is not the solution. Anyway, that's an opinion. I think it's a fact, so I'm not going to back off that. Brandy Lunsford, yes. You talked about the culture of disabilities. But you mentioned this, and I never thought about disability culture and how complicated it is, because it could be psychological, it could be or mental illness, it could be any of the drug addictions and opiates, or it could just be a physical disability of birth. I mean, there's so many variations of it. And in our culture, proudly, we do talk about it. We have laws that children with disabilities are supposed to be in school with other children. As you may know, I don't know if you know this, some cultures keep them separate because they're out of sight, out of mind. That's the way it used to be in the United States. I remember a lady that her son had a terrible disease, progressive brain disease. And of course, he was relatively normal, acting 5-year-old, 6-year-old. And as he got older, the schools in this town, Oklahoma, they just didn't want to educate him. It was just one battle after another. Was he going to graduate? Well, he probably wasn't going to live to graduation. But their attitude was, we don't want to mess with this kid. I mean, he doesn't have much of a future. Think about to the parents, oh, my child doesn't get to go to high school. He's just going to stay home until he dies. And that's the message that was sent to the family. And they just constantly had to fight the school board or the school administrators. And believe it or not, I don't care if you have the law on your side, sometimes you don't always get you don't get justice. Something Maggie said, culture isn't just holiday traditions and food. It is those things, but it's also the everyday way of completing tasks and language that make up culture, and culture is obviously important to every student. Would we be able to make larger strides in cultural awareness if we discuss the deeper part of culture with younger students? Or is that the idea completely beyond us? So this is a challenge to the sometimes anxiety over going into too much detail with younger kids. Kind of have to decide there. I can't give you, and I gave you an idea about maybe you don't want to go too deep with kids a certain age, but I can't just make that, I can't make some straight rule but you know where you stop at. Sometimes you have to push and get in some trouble. Really good one in here by Jamie about disability role models and showing people with disabilities that were successful. And she got Albert Einstein, John Lennon. Guess what? You can look and find there people that have been very successful and affected culture. Yeah, it wasn't just Helen Keller, by the way. And another person mentioned, I think it was Jennifer? No, it must have been Susan. Okay, I'm not sure. I got these mixed up. But it's talking about the movie Hidden Figures as a good example of that's 17, that's 18. Oh, here it is. Susan, yeah. The movie Hidden Figures as a great movie to minorities. And you got to show people that had to overcome real struggles. Just showing a picture of Martin Luther King's not going to do it. People don't know what King went through. Jacob, you have this robotics class, and I really enjoyed that. You had a very good discussion in there with middle schoolers about traditional views of American history. By the way, some of these discussions come up in classes where you weren't even based on that. Erica, you have a great entry on there about LGBTQ communities, QT. Sorry, I always get those back. About you never had a student come out as being gay. It's not because you didn't think there weren't any gay students in your school. They were there. And you think about those students that are lying there. I think I told you I had a guy that many years ago in school that rather mysteriously committed suicide as a senior in Macon High School. And then I didn't think about him for a long time. and it was all kind of, we didn't know what happened, and no one would have talked about whether he was gay. I don't know that, but I just know he took his life, and there were some indications that somebody alluded to the fact he might have been gay. I remember at the time, but then no one talked about it anymore because we didn't talk about those things. And then years later, I ran into his brother on Facebook, and his brother talked about his death. Young man committed suicide. And he said, "Well, I had a brother a long time ago, but he's gone." And it really upset me because I knew his brother that committed suicide. He's a nice guy, and I just thought about how sad that his brother dismissed. I'm sure he loved him and everything, but it's just that it's almost an afterthought. I had a brother, but he died. And I was thinking about his life and what might have been different if he could have had some either understanding. Okay, he didn't probably need counseling. There was nothing wrong with him, but there was something wrong with the rest of us. Nobody said anything. Anyhow, I think I'm about out of gas. You're probably tired of looking at me. Again, the student-led discussion is big. Travis, you had a really good entry in here about teaching. You would choose level 3, challenging. Why are white people always in charge? People sometimes ask that, and your world, you put yourself up to a 3.5, and you like to talk about, hey, let's talk about the ugly side of history. Let's talk about, I'll give you an example, Wounded Knee, South Dakota, December 1890. During the Ghost Dance, what's left of the 7th Cavalry shoots and slaughters about 120 Native Americans, and their bodies were frozen stiff and just thrown up on wagons and buried in a mass grave. It was just a massacre. And it was a massacre of people, unarmed people. Had it been reversed, it would have been the most horrible thing imaginable. But because it happened that way, it was thought, oh, well, got a new one for you. Tulsa, Oklahoma is now investigating the massacre of several hundred African Americans during a race riot by non-blacks, mainly whites, who burned down the black section of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Literally, it was a very rich area of Tulsa, and they looted and burned down the place, the banks, the stores, the businesses. Catastrophic. And the only people who got jailed were black, probably because they found them beat up on the street and charged them with assault. It was pure race attack, and for many years, people of Tulsa have refused to even talk about it, even though it's 90 years. You say, oh, it's just old history. No, but the bodies are still there under a parking lot somewhere in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Nobody wants to deal with it. And now there's a mayor who promised for years if he ever became mayor, he's going to bring up this ugly side of Tulsa's history. Caitlin, you had a good entry on the religious aspects here about Christians and Muslims and how we should discuss these things. That it's a natural thing. It shouldn't, religion shouldn't prevent you talking about other religions. And I think that's about it. I didn't get everybody. I talked about most of you. Oh, John Lindblad, you had a good one here on skilled sciences with machines and multiculturalism. And I like that. I think you're the one who teaches about robotics. And the kids we're in the class talking about that, which was interesting. I never thought about it. I think yours was the one before too about robotics. Or maybe there's 2 robotics classes in here. That you can be in a class and then the issue comes up and you address it. It's really cool. So I appreciate this outstanding entry. I know I've talked too long. Forgive me. I'm going to get off here right now, but I wanted you to know how much I valued, and I'm going to give you a credit on stuff, and I'm going to catch up on the grade book. But I wanted to try to cover as much of this as possible because I felt there's too many things I couldn't just talk to you individually, that other people were cheated of that information. So I try to give it to you this way. If you don't like this, okay. If it's too long, watch what you want. Thank you.